Welcome to Nerds Amalgamated, a podcast that covers the latest events in science, pop culture, and gaming.
I'm the professor, aspiring game developer, sci-fi aficionado, and completely and undeniably a geek trying to take over the world. I'll be breaking down the news from tech to gaming.
I am the DJ, a humble nerd, a big weeb,
and a watcher from the halls of the multiverse.
Just kidding. Anyways, I'll be breaking down all things comics to movies to anime.
Join us and stay hydrated as we quench you with witty banter, unintentionally hilarious hot takes, and trivia more fun than a night at the pub, courtesy of Nerds Amalgamated. Welcome back to Nerds Amalgamated. This week we're joined by James Bailie, a historian and game developer. Can you tell us a bit about your work, James?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a historian is my kind of primary day job, as it were. I work for the Institute for Iranian Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. My particular specialism is that I work on the medieval history of Georgia and Armenia, the sort of Caucasus region. But I also do a lot of work with digital systems and how computers represent history in all sorts of ways. Sometimes that's building actual academic databases of people or places from the medieval period, but it can also be looking at how computers represent history to people all over the place today, whether that's Wikipedia, whether that's whatever generative AI is spitting out this week, or whether it's computer games. And I've had a very long interest in gaming and games, and I've been developing my own games for quite a number of years. I released my last sort of main project at the end of 2024, a sort of roguelike RPG called The Exile Princes. And yeah, I particularly enjoy making and modifying and messing around with role playing and strategy games. Yeah, I think that's the basics.
Okay, so what sort of drew you to studying the Caucasus region? Is that something you picked, or did you get assigned to it and stuck with it?
No, it's very much something I picked. I'm sort of winding back through the backstory of it. I guess part of it is just that it starts with me having the kind of brain where if you say your options are this thing and this thing, I will try and work out what the third option was that people weren't telling me about. So, when I was first learning about ancient history, it's all you get to get your kind of Greece and Rome in the classical civilization class or whatever. And so I became interested in Carthage because, of course, I did. And similarly with the medieval world, you have your kind of knights and castles, Western European stuff. Occasionally, you get a bit of like Islam and the Crusades and so on. And then you have this sort of Eastern Christian world and various other religions kind of sits between those things and really complicates the story in ways that are interesting. So I think that drew me to be interested in, kind of medieval Greece, Byzantium, that part of the world. And then getting into the Caucasus specifically was kind of a case of me doing my master's, looking at some of this stuff and going, I could really do with a good book on this topic. And just working out that there wasn't one available in English. So it was a bit of a case of, well, I can't find the book I want to read, so I guess I'm going to go and spend half a decade writing it. And that was that was my doctorate. So it was, curiosity. So it is a brilliant part of the world to study.
Okay.
On that line, how many languages do you speak then? Do you speak any of these ancient languages, or?
There's very few. I'm not a good linguist by the standards of historian. So besides obviously English, which is my native language, I have a lot of languages to the extent that I can kind of translate things at translating speed. But one thing you find out, I think, the more languages you get to is there's a big difference between I can translate this piece of text and I can speak this language fluently. So there's a definitely a speed issue. I mean, if I get a passage of medieval Georgian, then I can sit down with a dictionary and kind of hack my way through it. But it's not a quick process.
How long does it not on average? How long would it take for on average?
Oh, good. I'm potentially quite a long time. The one of the issues when you get to medieval language, in particular, and more so with a language like Georgian, which is it's a rare language. There just aren't that many surviving medieval Georgian texts in total that we have. So that means there can be a lot of issues that are almost out of reach for even someone like me who's a specialist historian because they are like specialized linguistics level problems. So if you have a word that and you don't know what it means in the text, then the thing you need to do to figure it out might be to look at how that word is translated between other medieval languages. So in that case, it might be Greek, for example. You might have a copy of the Georgian text, and so you need to look at the Greek text. So then you also need medieval Greek, and then you might need medieval Arabic. So there are some people who are very pure language specialists, and I wish I was able to bug them with questions more often than I can do. So yeah, I guess subspecialisms within history, some people very much go down that specialized kind of cross translations route, which is really necessary for working out what these texts mean in a very precise way. Whereas a lot of what I do, I suppose, is more taking taking that bit those bits of work and looking at systematizing, cataloging, and saying, okay, so from what we've done on the kind of textual side, what does that actually mean? What does that look like as a society? How do these people fit together? How does this sort of social structure work? So problems like why is this person claiming this title? The textual work will tell you, okay, this person is has said that they are the Shah of wherever. But then going, what does that mean in practice? Is often a more complicated question in itself, and that's the area that I kind of really dig into and go, okay, so you say you're Shah of this place, you're definitely not, but also what's going on here? And there can be all sorts of complicated things about what people are claiming, how people relate to power in different ways, and often ways that I think we don't expect today, because modern people tend to assume that medieval countries work like modern countries, and that there are these like independent sort of nation state things. And a lot of it in the Middle Ages is much more driven by personal relationships. It's much more, I am the vassal of this person. I'm not a subject of a country. This is a personal relationship I have to this king. And so that adds lots of potential for different ways of like ruling places and governing things in ways that I think are sometimes quite alien but also very interesting today.
I am curious to ask, whenever you see the modern, like the modern medieval shows, in which is the most accurate one in from your point of view, like looking at it from a historian's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't watch enough of them to have a like decidedly like good tier list. The I guess I play games a lot more than I watch shows in general. But I guess one of the things I would say is that the way people tend to do this is often sort of based on the idea of is it more or less accurate, as if that's a single scale. And I think the thing I'd most like people to think about differently is to think, actually, this isn't just a single more to less accurate bar line, because different things can be accurate or not accurate. And so there are some things where like they have really paid a lot of good attention to detail on, does this sword look right and does this building look right? But the way that people are acting and interacting with each other is completely out the window. So actually, sometimes you find even that there'll be some fantasy shows that get the tone of a person interacting with another person more medieval than some shows or games or whatever where they've really gone all in on physical material accuracy, but actually have everybody behaving in a much more modern way.
So, would you say that's your biggest annoyance with media set in that time period, or do you have something that bugs you even more?
Um, I think the only thing that really tends to bug me is when people are making particular claims about their thing being accurate. Like, I don't mind people doing inaccurate media. I think the idea of like accurate representation of the past, there is some looseness to it inherently. I mean, partly because we don't know everything about the Middle Ages, and also because we do a lot of playing with medieval fantasies. Dragons did not exist in the Middle Ages. On the other hand, people did believe dragons existed in the Middle Ages. So, is an accurate representation one that fits the medieval person's perception or the medieval person's reality? There's all those kinds of complexities. So, I don't mind people taking lots of different angles on that, and I think more different possibilities and ways of looking at it is often good. The thing that tends to frustrate me most is when people say we have made the most accurate thing ever, because that's usually not true, and it's often being done to sell something else. And sometimes to sell a particular inaccurate idea of the Middle Ages. You definitely find people who, again, really load up on the kind of material accuracy because they're trying to sell you a version of the Middle Ages that is specifically inaccurate in some other way. And you get this, I mean, I think probably more so in Europe than a lot of other places, but in a lot of bits of Europe, you get that to sell particular, political ideas as well can often come along with it because so many countries have their idea of their, great heroic medieval past and so on that's, there is a very real kind of real world impact to some of that stuff, which is much more difficult.
I
So,
mean,
do you have a
but-
favorite medieval themed video game?
Ooh, that is difficult. Too many of them, but I mean, I guess I'm gonna I can give some shout outs to kind of smaller games particularly because I think there are a bunch of games that where the kind of the big banner games that everybody's heard of, your Kingdom Come Deliverance or whatever, or if on a more fancy end, your kind of Witcher or games and so on. They all obviously have some kind of medieval aspects to them. But I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff being done in the more kind of indie sphere as well. So there's things like Under the Yoke, small indie game, kind of about medieval peasant life. That's good fun. I mean, I do have a soft spot for the Mountain Blade series. I used to do an awful lot of modding of the first Mountain Blade game. I mean, Manor Lords is a very pretty game. It's not, I could go into depth on some of the accuracy issues, but it's a good game and makes you some very pretty medieval settlements. So I enjoy playing it quite a lot. I mean, in terms of accuracy, Crusader Kings 3 is sort of, in a sense, always the obvious winner because it's trying to do things in so much more depth than most other games. That does make it so complicated it's almost unplayable sometimes. So that is one of the difficulties we have with this stuff as well, is if you make something that is more, quote, accurate, actually as a game developer, you don't have time to get your modern 21st century gamer up to speed with everything they need to know to run a medieval kingdom, which includes knowing all of the hundreds of people that a medieval ruler would have to know to do that and what they're all like and so on and so forth. You can't speed run 20 years of somebody's life in a 5-minute game tutorial. So I think that's one of the things. That's one of the other kind of things around what makes a good medieval video game is sometimes it's the ones that focus on a particular thing and do it well, rather than trying to say we're going to just load everything in and sink or swim. Good luck.
I was
So,
gonna ask.
go
Oh,
on,
sorry.
DJ.
I was gonna ask. What do you think? When you see the modern video games, what is the biggest red flag you see in modern video games when it comes to like when it comes to replaying the Middle Ages sort of settings? Like, what's the biggest red flag you've noticed?
Oh, yeah, that's tricky. I think for me, the biggest red flag is stuff that is often there to be like, it's usually the stuff that is trying to do gritty Middle Ages for the sake of being. It's particularly throwing in very ahistorical amounts of certain sorts of, brutality, some of which existed very occasionally in the Middle Ages, obviously. But I think there is sometimes a big sense that, oh, we're doing the Middle Ages, so it has to be bleak and brown and grey, and everybody is sad, and there's a whole bunch of and everybody is being killed by bandits, and there's a whole bunch of you know interpersonal corruption and sexual violence and all that side of that is very much a strand in modern medievalism, as we put it. Like medievalism, when we use that term, is the stuff that is kind of like the Middle Ages, or is about how people think of the Middle Ages now. So if I say medievalist or medievalism, that's what I mean. So yeah, I think often the red flags are that for me it's that particular strand of this, this is completely this is actually it's ahistorical in a way that is trying to sell this slightly weird sometimes idea of the Middle Age, because I mean medieval people still had fun. Um this was not a period that is just all kind of doom and gloom and grim-faced men with fizzled jawlines and large swords.
for,
There's a lot more to the Middle Ages than that, and I see more of that in games.
for a second there, you just described an episode of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, yeah, yep, yep, yep. That's Game of Thrones is kind of on that list. I would say, or can be. Yeah, it's. But no, I mean, it's. I think the kind of color palette thing is particularly interesting to me. Actually, Game of Thrones is a classic example of this. Just everything goes down to very muted, dark colors, so you have very low contrast. It's almost, I mean, in some cases, I think they've explicitly gone out to try and shoot everything in like grey, overcast weather or whatever, just to like maintain that we're in the Middle Ages depressed mood. But you know, the sun shone exactly the same way in the Middle Ages that it does today. That's one of the things we can be pretty certain about. And yeah, and then when you look at what medieval people are writing, the manuscripts we've got, they are full of bizarre and interesting and fun stories. And yeah, I would like some more of some of that side of the kind of whimsy and humanity in the Middle Ages to be present. I mean, the bad stuff was absolutely present in the Middle Ages, but I think it's good to have that balance because it maintains the way that we see these past people as human rather than just as sort of, oh well,
Everything
the
was
kind of
despotic.
yeah, 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 yeah. Um,
So I guess one of the questions I've got in my notes is going to show a bit of my own bias there. While I was looking into your work, I found out about a game you made for a 3-day historically accurate game jam called Fenlander.
yep.
And what I've written is, do you think survival games are the best genre for portraying how brutal life was in that era?
Oh, that is interesting. And the answer is basically no. But I'll go into why. Because I think the modern survival game really comes out of, rather than being trying to portray what pre-modern life was, what the survival game comes out of in genre terms is really something much more like Western, like frontier mythos. It's part of almost the American Western genre, and this idea, and it is a very kind of 19th century American idea of a man on his own against the world. And medieval societies did not work like that at all, which isn't to say that they weren't, tricky, potentially brutal survival challenge, but they worked in a very different way. In particular, survival was a very communal problem for people in the past. Almost nobody would live on their own. If you were any normal person in society, you'd probably be living in a fairly extended household with maybe as many as two other generations of your family. And you'd be very reliant, even then, on a lot of relations with your neighbors. There'd be a fair bunch of you producing things they couldn't, them producing things you couldn't. And things like taxes in a lot of medieval societies were levied on a village scale. This was something that you collectively, as a group of people, had to be dealing with and had responsibilities for. So I think the survival genre often kind of sweeps all of that side out the window in favor of this what is very much a core fantasy of a lot of survival games of, oh, you could do this all by yourself without anybody else, that this is just a progression of steps and things that you have to do, and that it's a very solo potentially experience. So I think that's one thing that makes almost everything in the survival genre pretty radically different to how anybody in the Middle Ages would have experienced similar conditions. And the medieval world had very few people as well who were really totally cut off in that way. Medieval people had very, very wide trade networks. Whilst a lot of people in the Middle Ages, your kind of most of your peasant population did not move around a lot, they were also the people who were living very communally in villages. Whereas the people who could go out on their own and did move around were often very highly trained specialists of some kind or other and were moving around to do their job. And that might be merchants, but it also might be mercenaries, it might be priests. And people moved a lot further than sometimes people think they do. I mean, we have Armenian medieval graves, at least as far away as Germany. In fact, I think there might even be one in Iceland somewhere. So somebody who came from basically Western Asia and got out as far as Iceland. And we know that people were trading things very long distances. Nutmeg, the spice, was only grown in this period on, I think, one of the islands in Indonesia. And people were using it in Europe. So there was some very long distance, and it wasn't, one person taking it to Europe, but there were some very long distance travel routes that were happening. So yeah, I think that sense of a solo person and the complete wilderness is often quite different how people experience the Middle Ages. I think if you want to think about peasant life, what Fenlander tries to do as a game is much more about putting you in that village context. You basically can't win a game of Fenlander if you choose not to talk to anyone. You will just end up struggling to fish enough eels and you will then die because you can get any other nutrition in your body. So that's kind of the point that game was trying to make almost. But then I think other games I mentioned Under the Yoke earlier, that's much more a kind of peasant life simulation that tries to actually dig into what that sort of lifestyle was like. But yeah, I guess that's my take on that. In any case, it's the I think there are lots of more interesting things you could do with survival mechanics in medieval games, but I think the average survival game is trying to do something quite different.
Now when you think about it, when you say the whole communal living thing in the Middle Ages stuff, I'm just wondering, I'm just picturing a scenario. Imagine if The Last of Us was in Middle Ages with this sort of communal living thing. How would the story
Oh
be
yeah,
like? Like she's the cure, Ellie's the cure for the Black Plague. How to deal with this?
oh yeah. I mean, and actually, this is something that kind of post-apocalypse games in general. It's something that actually does make a lot more sense than the way that post-apocalypse games worked. If people were in that kind of scenario, they would be having to band together a lot more than a lot of those kind of zombie type movies tend to suggest. It's just part of how humans have to survive in survival situations. As a species, we're very much a sociable animal, and people out on their own generally tend to last a lot less long.
Your other major project, the Exile Princes,
Yeah.
is it sort of reminds me of the old Heroes of Might and Magic games. You have a hero unit traveling around building an army and completing quests. Was that an inspiration for it?
Um, it was one of the inspirations, yeah. I guess I would say the biggest inspiration for the character arc, I suppose, was Mountain Blade. In that's, I guess, another situation where you have your kind of core character, your bunch of upgradable troops, and these various sort of static cities on the map that you can eventually, take over and capture, and so on. I suppose different to either of those games, the things I wanted to do with it were to I mentioned earlier kind of leaning into the more whimsical, fantastical side of the Middle Ages, and the doodles people made in the corners of medieval manuscripts are a fantastic example of that. And that's basically how I did the graphics for that game. Most of what you see in the Exile Princes and the little tile art graphics are pretty much all out of actual medieval manuscripts. So a bunch of the inspiration, I guess, also just came from that actual material itself, and looking at this and going, "This is nuts. What can I do with this?" So yeah, merging kind of that with a sort of more secondary world building and so on from your kind of Mount and Blade heroes and Might and Magic. Those were really the two main things that came together, I think, while building it.
How did you try and balance it out when you make that game? Like, how did you like go? Okay, I want to put some aspects of this, but I don't want it to clash with the other aspects of that. And then how was it? Was it a long and arduous process, or was it was very easy? Just
I think, I mean, a lot of it was vibes, to be honest. It was just play it regularly, work out if it's working. I think if you're a bigger developer, then there's a lot more kind of, even from early stages, kind of quality assurance to be done. In my case, as a solo developer, not really on a commercial basis, I was sitting there going, well, I'm going to try and make a game that I want to play, and if I'm finding it fun, then somebody else will probably find it fun. Um, the I the other part of it also is that it was quite an unplanned game. It was one of those things which, I mean, like Fenlander was sort of originally intended to be a 1 or 2 week project to mess around with some things and see what I could do, and then ended up being a 5 year project. Um, so a lot of the elements got built in quite slowly over time and kind of built up in ways where I kind of knew how the game already worked and could add things in quite small fractions rather than having these like big blocks of stuff to amalgamate together. So by the time I was putting in a lot of the later stuff, I already had a good sense of how my own setting and world building worked, what would mesh and what wouldn't mesh with the tone I was going for, that kind of thing.
So, your games tend to have quite simplistic graphics. Is that a deliberate stylistic choice? Like you mentioned, you used medieval doodles of creatures for Exile Princes, or are you proudly embracing the programmer art stereotype?
I think both is probably the answer to that. The Exile Princes, once I'd decided it was going to be a this kind of marginalia tile art style, I was very much working with that. In more general terms, I mean, graphics are not my greatest passion as a developer. I would like to make graphically better games, and for my next game project, I am planning to do quite a big shift up in graphics. Not to anything particularly modern and fancy, but the it will be a bit less in the kind of move a single block around the screen scale. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing other things with different sorts of graphics. It's partly also just what's possible in a solo project. What I wanted to spend time on with the Exile Princes was the kind of core mechanics and the depth of storytelling. One of the sort of reviews I had for the game said, "Is this a game or is it a story generator?" And I think it is both. And like the thing I wanted to play with most with that game was, how can I use something that's quite procedurally generated, quite randomized, and give you these different blocks, these different quests, these different people you can meet, and make you feel like you were a character in a different story every time. And so that was the thing that I was really going into depth on. So doing lots of things like writing dialogue, little vignette lines for interactions with companions, all of that kind of stuff. That really was where the time went in the Exile Princes, rather than going on making the graphics proportionally more fancy. But for other games, you need different things, and I'm planning for the next game to be moving to something that's a bit more of a kind of scripted rather than procedurally generated role playing game, and that might well want quite a different graphical style. So
Okay. I've skimmed through some of your papers and noticed that you've written a lot about the intersection of gaming and history, and one of your papers even covers Dawn of War's Necrons.
yes.
What's been your favorite topic to write about on that sort of theme?
Oh, yeah, that's tricky. I mean, the Necrons were fun, um, but yeah, I think a lot of the papers I write, I tend to write the kind of stuff that scoots over quite a lot of games rather than depth studying one or two. I have an unpublished thing which I hope to get finished at some point on the Hades game, which I think actually is a really interesting case study for the things I'm working on. Because I mean, obviously, Hades, it's ancient Greece, right?
Yeah.
But then the more you look at those games with, my brain as a medievalist, the more you're like, that's not ancient Greek, that's not ancient Greek, that's not ancient Greek. What is all of this medieval stuff doing here? In Hades 1, they have like you're in Tartarus, the depths of the ancient Greek hell. They have stained glass window. The ancient Greeks did not have stained glass. That's a
Oh,
medieval, classically medieval church window. Um, then they have the asphodel level in Hades 1 is this sort of big rivers of fire type thing. Asphodel in ancient Greek literature is a meadow of flowers. Asphodels are literally a type of flower. But they've done it that way so it looks much more like our vision of hell as being full of rivers of fire. And we get that vision of hell from medieval doom painting. So there's a whole bunch of these medieval things that creep their way in, either because, on the one hand, there are some things like how we think about hell is just filtered through a medieval lens. We kind of, modern people have that sort of burning lakes thing so fixed into their heads from the medieval period that they would find it weird if you had a game set in the underworld and didn't have that. You get exactly the same thing if you go back to like Age of Mythology. If you look at the Erebus levels in that, all of their like rivers are lava. Again, completely not how the ancient Greek underworld did anything, but that makes it quite interesting to me as okay, are there some things where the Middle Ages has just become so locked into our conscious that we can't get it out? And then there are other things that have become locked in much more recently through gaming itself, because the people who wrote D&D were massive medievalism nerds. So you get your kind of thing where in one of the later levels of Hades, you end up basically fighting rats in a sewer, and that is very like 1970s, 80s British Warhammer fantasy role playing kind of pathetic aesthetic stuff. It's a kind of medievalism because it comes through from the idea of, oh, rats carry plague, so we're doing poison rats. But it's also very filtered through the kind of recent generations of sort of D&D, Warhammer, all of that kind of stuff, ingrains these as gaming trope. So the medieval idea gets into the gaming, and then the gaming kind of carries itself onwards into other games. And so these ideas, move forward, get replicated, pass on.
have you ever played Dante's Inferno on on PS3?
I haven't. No, I don't actually have a PS3, which is probably one of the
Ah.
major reasons why. Um,
There's a similar it's a similar thing as well. Like you go through hell, and Dante Alighieri going through hell, and I think that's how they. I might be pretentious in this part, but I think they based hell off that, and they go like, oh, this is how hell is like. Okay, let's replicate that.
yeah. No, the Dante's Inferno stuff is hugely in every version of Hell since. So. I mean, actually, another thought on that is that one thing you find which is quite interesting is there are some medieval texts that are basically just riffs or repackagings of ancient world mythology about the underworld. And one of the interesting things you find is that medieval people kind of, when they reset them for their own time period, they don't put them in hell. So in the ancient Greek myths, there's Orpheus and Eurydice. It's the kind of musician who goes to try and rescue his lover from the underworld. But when you have the medieval version of that, which is Sir Orfeo, it's a Middle English text that is taking the ancient Greek story and rewriting it for a modern 13th century audience, um, possibly 14th. But the interesting thing is they actually send him basically to like the kind of fairyland, essentially, the sort of fey, the mysterious fey world, rather than making him go to hell, because for the medieval reader, hell has gained all of the very kind of Christian symbolic meaning. And so actually, when the medieval writer takes this ancient Greek story, he resets it rather than in hell into something that has that sort of mysterious otherworld quality, but doesn't have all of the religious symbolism that his contemporary readers might have for it. So I think that kind of resetting and playing with ideas between historical periods is quite interesting in terms of, yeah, even for the medieval people, they were starting to think of these things differently and having to take old stories in new directions.
Okay, I am curious to ask, what is your take on Assassin's Creed when they do that sort of similar thing from your standpoint?
Um, I think Assassin's Creed is. I mean, it's sort of such a huge core series for any kind of historical gaming that it's sort of hard to know where to start with it. I mean, I think that a lot of the Assassin's Creed stuff works for what it is, but you just need to take it for what it is. I mean, Assassin's Creed is one of those classic examples where they are really, really good at doing a lot of research on how people are talking and what things look like and so on and so forth. But they are obviously telling their own kind of actually ultimately almost science fictiony story in places. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a very strong opinion either way on that. I think that there are definitely some difficulties they get sometimes when putting various historical things through this lens where they have to make every event in history ends up having to be assassins and Templars, whatever period they're in. And that does distort some of the things they're presenting, obviously. But if you accept that that is their core premise, then you just kind of have to roll with it. But I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there as well. I have a joke with one of my friends where I learned some ancient Greek as part of my studies, and he learned some ancient Greek from playing a lot of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And the result of this is his classic Greek pronunciation is better than mine because I learned Greek in a modern academic setting where a lot of the pronunciations that everybody uses are kind of anglicized, Latinized. Whereas he only learned it from that game where they tried to make everything like pinpoint pronunciation to classical Attic Greek. So I learned about Socrates at university, so I call him Socrates. But he does the more correct Socrates because that's what the game does. So I think there's some interesting like things they can reflect there. Um,
So in other words, he just cheated on the video game. That's
but yeah,
actually
doesn't
funny.
really help with the text, but the pronunciation, yeah, they did solid on that.
Uh-huh. You live?
Yeah, I'm alive. I was just checking through the notes, trying to work out what we covered or not. So, along that line, Assassin's Creed tends to try to squeeze in their plot in places where it doesn't really belong, but they also have accurate pronunciations, and I believe they use the 3D model of the Notre Dame for the fire reconstruction.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Is there any game that you think is surprising that it got the history right?
Ooh, yeah, that is an interesting one. I think the surprises for me tend to come in the bits that I find surprising tend to be much more if I'm playing a fantasy game that has an interesting bit of history in. Like if I'm playing a game that is has already told me we're doing history, then I will be less spending my time being surprised if they got it right and more time being like noticing where they got it wrong. Whereas I think some of my favorite sort of bits of history and game stuff are often I'm struggling to think of a good example now, but there have definitely been times where I've been playing stuff which is entirely fantastic, and there is some bit of interaction or way that something works. For like, oh yeah, no, that's actually that's pretty good for how a medieval society should work. So yeah, I think and I think there is some debate about this with kind of historians like me who work on this stuff about to what extent do we include the kind of fantasy genre stuff in our considerations for when we're looking at historical games. And I very much think it has to be in there because for so many people, the way they interact with the Middle Ages is through fantasy as much as it is through Assassin's Creed or which already is like has a big dollop of sci-fi and fantasy in it. But as much as those sorts of games, there's a whole bunch of people whose idea of the Middle Ages is shaped by Skyrim and The Witcher and so on. So I think we have to think about those. Actually, I'll give you one example that I thought was really nice. In To go back to a survival crafting game, Return to Moria, the kind of um, dwarves going back into Moria in the Fourth Age Tolkien survival crafting game. Very not medieval, except in that it's got a bunch of fantasy stuff in it. But the thing I really liked there is that they abandoned the classic mechanic of you find dead dwarves around the place and you loot. That game has a very separate mechanic where you find dead dwarves around the place and you basically have to kind of honor them and bury the dead properly. And that provides you with a different, I mean, it provides you with a sort of resource, but not something that you can trade for other resources or anything. So you get much more of a sense of this is actually something that is sufficiently important to your character and what your society is like that it's baked into the mechanic. And that's something I really like, and it's something I think is often missing in other medieval games, which tend to have this very, modern, very material sense of everything, which is one of the huge challenges for, again, the quest for a quote accurate medieval game, is medieval people thought about stuff different. Most medieval people were religious and understood religion in ways that most people don't, even who are religious today. So getting people to having mechanics that kind of point people in that direction and get people to think about the fact that death is not just, oh, the pixels moved on my screen and there was some blood, you know, that there is actually a sort of emotional and for a medieval person or pseudo medieval character spiritual weight to what's happening there. um I think that was really interesting that they found a way to present that in mechanics, and that's the kind of thing I would quite like to find a bit more in other games.
So in terms of like the little details that they should put in more effort in and give it's kind of like fan service in the manner.
A little bit, but I think you can do it in a way that isn't fan service. I mean, to go back to my Return to Moria example, that is, it is something that is integrated into the mechanics. It does gain you stuff to do it. It's just that they've replaced looting with a different mechanic set. Because these are your dead, and of course you wouldn't want to loot them. That's just not how the culture they're presenting works. And we see a lot of this. If you look at medieval societies and texts, things like burying the dead and ensuring people are buried properly and in the right place are very big concerns for people in the Middle Ages. And yet, I can't think of many other medieval games that actually even let you bury a dead person you find on the road. Whereas for a medieval person, that would be absolutely like thing A. The idea that you would just pass a corpse on the road and leave it lying there. I mean, I'm sure people did that in the Middle Ages, but it was not the done thing certainly for most European and Asian medieval society. So yeah, I think getting mechanics in there that reflect those sorts of ways of thinking. I think that would be an interesting thing to push more on in medieval gaming.
So, we've got a few sort of fun questions. What is your favorite unanswered historical question?
True. That is interesting. Oh, there are some of them. Which does make it very tricky. I mean, I have a bunch of hyper needs because of my own work, but the kind of I suppose that the bigger scale stuff is often what interests me. And in some of those cases, it's the is this unanswered because we don't have an answer to it, or is it unanswered because we will just never manage to, it's the thing that you can argue the case on. You're kind of, why did the Roman Empire fall? That's never going to have a concrete answer. But we are going to end up with different positions on it. For the kind of minutiae type stuff, I would really like to know more about some of the people behind medieval writings. I think in a lot of cases. So, for example, the big kind of epic fantasy type text from medieval Georgia is a text which in Georgian is called Bepchist Hausani, which I'm not pronouncing very well. But in English is the Knight in Panther Skin. It's this it's a many, many lines long epic poem, which is all kind of, knights and castles and running around medieval Asia trying to rescue a princess, all that kind of stuff. It's like it genuinely holds up quite well as a story by the standards of these sorts of medieval texts. But we know very little about the guy who wrote it. We have a couple of possible references in other texts, but it's a bit of an if you squint at it. And I would love to know more about, who wrote it, what things he drew upon to write it, whether there were other texts in the period that were similar that we've lost. I think that sort of thing is often the stuff that I would most like to know, because we often have the text says something or reports on something, but actually what got us to the text that we have today is often the unanswered bit that I think a lot of historians nerd out about, particularly because, in a sense, we spend a lot of time with these people. I have spent a lot of time reading some medieval writers, and in some cases, I will never know their name if they left an anonymous text, let alone anything else about them. So, yeah, I'd be interested to find out more about the people whose works I've hung out with a lot over the.
I can totally see you now just trying to build that DeLorean and just go, okay, I need to go to this section of time, meet this guy that wrote this.
Oh god, yeah. I mean, sadly, digital history has not got into kind of atomic physics levels yet. But you never know. Um,
And on the same line, what is the weirdest historical fact you've learned?
I
that's
think he's
interesting. I mean, yeah. Again, there's a lot to choose from. I'll throw out. I could throw out a couple of. I mean, maybe not weird, but ones that I always find interest. One of the fun ones for gamers is how we know that people carried swords on their backs in the Middle Ages. Now,
oh
there are
yeah.
various modern people will tell you that carrying a sword on your back is a stupid idea, which it is. Like, you try and draw a sword that's carried on your back, and there is a reasonable chance you'll cut your own ear off. But we know that people carried swords in the Middle Ages because we have so many medieval bits of writing telling people not to carry swords on their back. Like, and to the point where it's just like you wouldn't be doing this if this wasn't a thing that was happening. Um, so it's one of those. Actually, there's a bunch of evidence for stuff in the Middle Ages that is just from telling somebody not to do it repeatedly, which I always enjoy. And I think the other things that often stand out to me are the bits that you don't expect because they are suddenly very human from a period of time where we don't think about people in such direct human terms. So there's a bit of an Armenian text that I've worked with where the chronicler is going through the like very long history of this elite Armenian family, and he goes down generation by generation and what they did and so on. And then he finishes it off with and I can't remember the guy's name, but and such, the last of the family was still living in my time, but he was very old and his feet pained him. And it's just like this whole kind of sweep of history then gets down to, and I met this guy and he was just an old guy with bad feet. And and just and then and I think I like that kind of thing because it suddenly hits you that, oh no, actually, this is kind of, this almost feels like a kind of Tolkien style rundown of someone's genealogy, and then you get to the end, it's like, oh no, but these actually, we're all real people with very real, just mundane level problems as well as everything else. And yeah,
it's like
I like that stuff.
it's like when you get the when you get like Santa, you're like, oh, Santa's this cool person, like he delivers presents, he has a sleigh, he's got magic and stuff. You meet him, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, there is an old guy with a beard is necessary for this. Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the other texts that I think that really rams this home is there is a Japanese text called the Pillow Book of Seishonagon. It was written about 1000 AD by a bored court noblewoman, and we don't have a ton of I mean, women's writing from a lot of the Middle Ages, which makes it interesting in of itself. But also, it's just like half of it is just BuzzFeed style listicles of things that she thought while she was sitting down. Like there is a chapter of this book, I mean, like a couple of pages worth, which is just a list of things that annoyed her. And it is right down to the level of, it's really annoying when there's a like snot-nosed kid and their parents think they're the best thing in the world, but they're actually just, making a mess all over the place. And it's and I when I do bits of teaching, I often give that one to students because particularly for a certain sort of student who has always thought of the Middle Ages as, oh no, it's the very serious time period. Actually, just having these, oh no, people were basically writing like BuzzFeed lists of things that made them annoyed or happy. um, um,
I could
um,
I could totally picture it now. Can you imagine like Total War and and Age of Empires? They have a text like that.
Yeah, but the thing is, these all existed in the same world. It is, it's the real world and it's there. And yeah, absolutely. But this is one of the things with, any game is only giving you a certain perspective on what was happening. And yeah, absolutely. The big old battles did happen, but there was a lot more to life than that. And you can do all sorts of varied takes, and you can integrate these things in interesting ways. It's things like your kind of medieval warfare stuff. Again, it's often done in this very blood and grit sort of way. But actually, that can introduce some unrealistic things, like casualty rates in total war battles. Like casualty rates in total war battles are quite low by the standards of like strategy genre games. But casualty rates in total war battles would not be sustainable by any actual military force in history. The number of people that die in most strategy games is wildly out of whack. If any culture was taking casualties at that rate, they would not be able to keep functioning, let alone keep waging war for more than like a year at most. And yet we just kind of go, oh well, and there are good game development reasons. From the game development perspective, it's actually really awkward if you have to do a lot of accounting for casualties, wounded people. It kind of feels a bit suckish if you're the player and half the time everybody runs away from you. But actually, I mean, sensibly, yes, people would run away from you. The kind of thing you get in a lot of role playing games where you get the three bandits who are like, yep, guy with a giant sword, we can take him, and maintain that attitude even after two of them have been bisected. you know People don't work like that. But like there are good gameplay reasons why it is that way, but it's one of the things that I think we have to accept about how we do games. And I think it's again interesting when you explicitly think about it that way, to go, could we do this in a different way that's interesting? Again, one of the things that I'm thinking about quite a bit for the next game project I have planned, which will there will not be any announcements about that for quite some time to come. But one of the things I am planning to think about quite a lot for it is, can I make a combat system that does different things to a lot of other role playing games in terms of making morale more central, making combat and the decision of whether to engage in combat a much more important element. Because, combat is dangerous in ways that games tend to shy away from. And I think there's some interesting stuff to be played around with there. And I think I've probably gone off on a tangent, so I will
That's okay.
let you ask something else.
Yeah, well, I think unless you have any last questions, DJ, we might wrap up there.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. Okay,
Far away.
okay, I got a couple of questions. So you're dropped into the Middle Ages with one modern video game item. What do you bring?
What I think what I bring is, I think probably what I bring is a musical instrument, actually, from whichever game. Because really, so my thinking here is, like I am 5'6" and have joint problems. Going for anything that would help me engage in combat is not going to help me very much. There's honestly not a huge amount that I can like reliably trade that I can think of from a modern video game. So the best thing for me to do is probably take something that I have a skill that I can make use of and can, potentially make a living doing it. And probably for me, the transferable thing I can do is either writing or music, given I'm not going to have a computer. So, yeah, um, I'll take a loot.
Fair enough. You must pitch a completely ridiculous historical game. What's the concept?
Oh, um, I think I want to. I think I would want to make a probably a really good, open world narrative role playing game, and I would probably just set it in the time period that I study. So, big, expansive medieval Caucasus game, but also doing a lot of things that other role playing games don't spend a lot of time on. So, there will be a lot more thinking about things like what clothes am I wearing? What does that tell people about me? How am I presenting myself? What languages do I speak? All of that kind of stuff that gets absolutely cut out of most role playing games. I think it'd be, you know, if I have infinite money and I'm doing something that's trying to be very historical, I'd be really interested in doing a game that leans heavily into the, you know, who are you in terms of how you're presenting yourself to the world as part of the problems that you're having to deal with? Because in most games, that's either a locked down choose your race at the start, or it's ignored completely. Whereas people are a lot messier than that. There are very few people whose identities can be summed up as one word. For me, like I'm from Norfolk, I'm English, I'm British, I'm European, and those things all mean different things in different situations. And that was true historically as well. And I think it'd be really interesting to make a game that played with that. Nobody would fund it, but it would be interesting.
Dude, can you imagine GTA mod as living in the Middle Ages?
I think somebody has tried to make a game called Grand Theft Horse, which has that premise. Actually, I've not played it, but
No,
I am pretty sure that Grand Theft Horse is a game that somebody is making. Um,
we like instead of the stars were wanting rating, it's five knights, knight helmets.
Something like that. Yeah. Actually, a very fun bit of medieval stuff to look up is medieval law codes in some cases because they have a bunch of weirdly specific laws. I was looking at some Italian law codes the other day from the Middle Ages, and it's got titles like, "Yep, this is the section on the reward you get for killing a wolf." And I'm like, okay, congratulations, 13th century law writer, you wrote a side quest into your local town law codes. Um, like, yeah, there's a good bunch of stuff out there.
I am curious. Speaking of lore and stuff, do you think of shows like Horrible Histories and Terrible History? Those types of shows when they show all these middle this disgusting stuff for the Middle Ages. And do you agree with it, or do you just kind of like, it's just a kid, so I don't mind it, like, or you just like,
I mean, I
re-
think it is made. I mean, I watched, I read a lot of the Horrible Histories books when I was a kid. I think that kind of stuff is often good for children because I think that's the stage at which get people interested is a core part of the goal. And always, I think for historians, if we want to communicate with people who are not historians, we do have to make some things interesting. And there's kind of two sides, I suppose, to historians engaging with the public. And sometimes historians forget that there are two sides, which is to say, there's one side which is stuff we want to persuade the public about. It would be better if we thought about things in this way, that we should see these people more as people in one way or another or whatever. But actually, I think if we're going to get a hearing to do that, we do need to say, okay, this is history and it's interesting and it's good and cool to be interested in, and there's and without just being like, oh yes, you should be interested in. No, we've got to be out there and talking to people and telling them about interesting, weird stuff in the past. And I think Horrible Histories often does a good job of that. I don't think it should be the only way to do that at all, but yeah, I think as part of the kind of wider ecosystem of how we explain history, I think it definitely has its place.
Oh, okay. I might do three more questions and then we'll call it. Which
Sure.
beloved historical game is secretly terrible history?
Um, um, yeah, I will probably open the can of worms and say I think it's probably Kingdom Come Deliverance, which has just this massive reputation for being hyper historically accurate, and again it is the classic example of they made the swords look great. Absolute props to them on the props, but some bits of the social history, like the way they represent the Cumans in the first game, um, and things like that. There's a lot lacking, and they've built it up so much to say this is hyper accurate that the lack is noticeable in a way it wouldn't be otherwise. So yeah, I'm gonna possibly a slightly controversial take, but yeah, I think in terms of the gap between what they claim about the accuracy and the actual accuracy, the claim is so high that even the moderately good accuracy still falls well short of what some people think it is.
Okay. Uh, if you could force every gamer to play one educational history game, what would it be?
Ooh, difficult. I'm trying to decide how much I hate gamers at this point. Um, no, insofar as like you could learn a lot by playing a lot of Crusader Kings 3, but also for a lot, I mean, some people love that game, and for a lot of people, it is too much. Um, I am actually going to throw back to the thing I said earlier and actually say Under the Yoke, in
Hmm.
that I think, as a contrast to how every other game that I've seen, or most of the games that I've seen, do medieval peasant, then I think it's actually good for people to see a game that thinks about peasant life in its own terms, because this is the life of 90% of pre-modern people, or variants on it. You know, if we're before the modern period and the modern way of urbanization, most people are peasants. That is the core of life in a way that I think people find it really hard to grasp. Because most people look at the Middle Ages and go, "Oh, I imagine being a knight or at least a merchant or a soldier or something." It's like, nope, you're rolling a d20, and if you roll anything other than a 20, you're a peasant. That's that's how this works. Um, and so I think, yeah, finding ways to engage people more with that life and the variations in it and what it was like, is something I'd like to do more through games.
Okay. Finally, what's a historical truth that makes most gamers uncomfortable?
Um, oh, I don't know about most gamers. Which is to say, I one of the things I think is generally true with history games is we don't actually have very good data level stuff on how gamers think about a lot of things. To the extent that anybody does have that data, it's a small number of very large companies. Like Ubisoft gets to collect a lot of data on players, but they don't give it to people like me. Um, so I guess but I think things that would make certain sorts of gamers or blocks of gamers uncomfortable. I think in both directions, being confronted with the realities of things like how ethnic identities and nationalities and gender worked in the Middle Ages. That is often slightly uncomfortable for everybody, regardless of what angle you're coming at it from, because so many people want to see themselves in the medieval world, and appreciating what the realities of that would have meant, and what the ways in which that was different to anything that they have in their heads. I think that often is quite uncomfortable for people, including people who want to see themselves as the I would have absolutely bossed it in the Middle Ages. It's like, would you though? Versus also, and when it comes to things like, diversity or how women were treated, all of that sort of stuff, there are people who have a pretty unrealistic idea that the Middle Ages was, you know, actually much sort of better than it was on those fronts. But there are also a lot of people who assume the Middle Ages was much sort of blander than it was on those fronts. This was not a time period in which nobody traveled. It was not a time period where people were suddenly completely like pure and uncomplicated in their identities. That is a modern fantasy as well.
Mm.
So and you see this a lot in all the backs and forths of the fantasy genre about people complaining about whether there are like characters of a particular race or gender in particular role playing games, all of that kind of stuff. I think if you were trying to go through it and be quote accurate, then the answers are not always comfortable for anybody in that conversation. But I think that actually talking about that is hopefully a useful thing for historians to do sometimes precisely because of that. Actually saying, these were real people and they lived in real situations that were very different from our own. And we have to find ways to think about them on their own terms as the starting point for this. Yeah, that's not always an easy conversation, but I think it's one that I would like us to have more sometimes.
Okay. Okay. Aside from, I will say, let's end it with a fun question. Just being that this was a serious question, let's end it with a fun one. Which
Absolutely.
historical, which historical figure would be the best Twitch streamer?
Okay. Again, too many options. I will throw out a few medieval names who I would love to see doing a Twitch stream. Um, the aforementioned Saishonagon, like bored Japanese court noblewoman who does BuzzFeed listicles, absolutely. She would complain endlessly about the aesthetics of every game, and it would be hilarious. Um, um, I will say there is a guy whose work I have looked at called Eustathius of Thessaloniki. Um, he was basically like, imagine a very sort of overly posh, classic Oxford or Cambridge University academic. Guy is basically that, but in the 11th, 12th centuries. He was his generation's expert on Homer and like the Odyssey and the Iliad. And if you haven't read the Odyssey and the Iliad, it's basically impossible to read anything he wrote, even in translation, because he uses so many like niche nerd references to his stuff that like the text makes no like he will sometimes reference a giant from the Odyssey and it was like, but we're in 12th century, and then you realize no, but the giant in the Odyssey throws rocks, and he's actually talking about catapults, just by analogy. And I think that guy would also be quite a funny Twitch streamer. So yeah, I'll go with those two as my picks.
I can totally see the other guy just like, actually, this is what Homer wrote. I can totally
Oh
see
yeah.
that.
Oh yeah. No, I mean get Eustathius to sit down and play Assassin's Creed Odyssey and well
It's like, hey, wait a minute, this is not accurate. Uh, on that note, Professor, yeah, we should call it.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, James.
thank you both.
And to everyone listening, look after yourself, stay hydrated. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, so check us out on social media. Check out on Spotify. If you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi page as well. Stay happy, stay nerdy. See you guys, and nice to meet you, James.
Thank you.